Way before skims and the multifaceted modern corset intrigue, there were bodies. Still pretty close to what we would call a modern corset, or a lace-up garment that was worn on the top of the body to provide structure and support. The Dorothea bodies that I've made previously on this channel, and this pair that were worn by a funeral effigy of Queen Elizabeth I, are some of the first extant examples of this very controversial garment. There's just something about these ideas and shapes that remains alluring even in a modern world that is full of novelty. There is perhaps no time period in fashion more alluring and visually pleasing than the Elizabethan period. Totally joshing you, the Elizabethan period is sartorially challenging to a modern eye. Depending, of course, on the exact year, the torso could be elongated, the skirts were either shaped like a cone or a drum. Pretty much the antithesis of what most modern dressers are trying to achieve. But I would venture that the bodies themselves are still pretty alluring. I want to reinterpret these bodies into a modern silhouette, but before I begin doing that, I want to actually understand how they work both physically and philosophically. So let's make these bodies reasonably closely to how they would have been made historically, but using a sewing machine because I have my limits. Luckily for me, these bodies are featured in the illustrious Patterns of Fashion 5. These bodies are actually remarkably simple. There are only 3 pieces, 5 if you count the shoulder strap piecings. It's noted in the book that they may or may not have been made for Elizabeth to wear. They show signs of being made in a rush and could have been made specifically for the effigy. But still, I printed the pattern out and held it up to my body to see how different in size I was to good Queen Bess. Very, as it turned out. The bodies were very, very narrow at the waist. Not surprising given the silhouette of the time. I used a precise, professional means to ascertain how much needed to be added, mostly to the waist. The bust was actually perfect. I slashed and spread the waist, but kept changes to the bust minimal. After a lot of this, I got a fit that was as close as it was going to get as a half body made from paper and held up by hand. The extant bodies are made of 2 layers of fustian, which is a cotton linen fabric. I think it's actually a warp of cotton and a weft of linen, I think. I could have that backwards. Anyway, I don't have any fustian, nor do I want to order any, so I'm going to use this cotton. This is actually a raw cotton denim in a similar twill weave pattern. I think it's going to be a pretty good stand-in for the fustian. Plus, I'm going to be using quite a bit of this throughout my collection, so it will help these kind of sit with everything really nicely, I think. And I will be cutting my toile out of this as well. I don't think I would get enough information cutting my toile out of calico or muslin because even the thickest calico is really flimsy. Sorry, I've got machine oil all over my hand because I was just doing some grungy stuff on the knitting machine. Anyway, it's ground in there, so it's not gonna come off on the fabric, just unsightly. Anyway, I don't think I would get enough information from using muslin for the toile, or calico from the toile. Sorry, throughout my fashion education, and also when I went to work for brands, I was always under the direction of an English-speaking person, like a person from England, and they call a muslin something that we would call a muslin, like a prototype, a toile, and they call what we would call like muslin fabric, they call calico. Muslin is something completely different in England. It's a specific kind of fabric. So now I use like calico, toile, muslin, all of that kind of interchangeably, which is kind of annoying. But anyway, that is neither here nor there. I'm going to use this for my prototype because I think that this is going to give me the best information to go off of about what I need to do with the pattern. And hey, if I don't need to do anything, if this actually works, then it can actually be my self fabric. So we shall see. I sewed the side seams and the shoulder piecings right sides together and pressed the seams. The muslin was actually perfect for an Elizabethan fit. Mind, this is not a time period known for its comfort and ease, so there will be about an inch of compression all around. And this would give a good, firm layer to pin all the various doodads and hoo-haws of the period onto, and also provide a solid structure for the enormous skirts to sit on top of rather than the wearer's hip. The muslin twill became the final fabric, and I wish I had cut another layer of the twill as lining to be similar in construction to the original, Instead, I cut a lining from this organic cotton voile, which was what we'll name Failed Dyeing Experiment Pink. Still a lovely shade, and something I just wanted to find a good use for. But we'll see how it holds up as a boning channel layer over time. I again sewed the side seams and shoulder strap piecings. I'll note that the extant stays do not have lining in the pieced area since it wasn't necessary to act as a boning channel. They really were whipped together as quickly as possible and without any fuss. But I had not read that far in Patterns of Fashion yet, so I did line mine. I lined up the complete self and lining, wrong sides together. It has been my experience that when cut and sewn separately, the self and lining of complex shapes like this will never match up perfectly, no matter how perfectly they were cut and sewn. Just the way it is. There is no seam allowance around the perimeter of the bodies, and they will eventually be finished with a binding, but to hold them in place in the meantime, I stitched around the bottom and center front edges at 1/8 inch. Not the top, since the boning still needs to go in. I marked out the boning layout in friction pen. The boning on the extant body stops well under the armpit edge and the neckline, a detail I included since a huge motivation for this recreation is learning why these things were made the way they were. Like the bodies themselves, the boning layout is beautifully simple. The bones are all vertical with the exception of a little funny business at center front. I sewed through both layers along all the boning channels. I backstitched at the bottom of the channels since that will be covered by the binding. And at the top, I stopped precisely on the stop line, pulled the front thread tail through to the back by tugging on the back thread tail, and tied them off. I was actually stoked to be able to do the pullback so easily. Before I switched to a servo motor, there was no way I would have been able to stop so precisely, and I had to actually use a needle to bring the front thread tail to the back. It's the little things, folks. Well, not little, there were exactly 100 of these stitch lines. I was there for a while regardless. Oh, and much like matching up the self and lining, somehow my boning channels never come out even and symmetrical from side to side on the first try. Something I usually only notice at the machine. As many extant bodies and stays and corsets, the extants are bound in leather, and I'd never bound any of my stays or corsets in leather, so this was a new experience. I'd had this little scrap of leather for years. It was very thin, buttery yellow Glover's leather of some sort, just a scrap I'd gotten from someone? Don't remember. Ideally, I'd use 1-inch strips to bind these, which would give me a 1/4 inch bound edge with the seam allowance tucked in. But obviously this scrap wouldn't give me 170 inches of 1-inch wide binding, so I cut 1/2 inch wide strips and hoped for the best. I laid a test strip along the top edge of the front of the bodies, right sides together. I stitched along the raw edges at 1/8 inch. It was okay, so I sewed more strips together to make a longer strip. Sewed this to the first binding strip, and continued to stitch the binding to the right side of the bodies. Ugh, doesn't this just always happen when you're sewing something particularly awful? I was so nervous about stitching around the bottom skirts of the corsets. Obviously, they're one of the more complex shapes one is likely to bind, but they were actually pretty simple, although I did hand crank the points. I tried turning in the edges of the inside to enclose the raw leather edge, but it was just too small an edge, too messy, so I felled the raw edge down directly. That is, before I made a dire realization. I have been so preoccupied with the whole, what binding am I going to use? Do I have enough of this leather? Is this actually going to work out? Is 1/8 inch going to completely not work? That I forgot that I was only supposed to bind the bottom of the bodies. So I bound the entire thing, which is great, right? That's super productive, except now I have no way to get the boning in. Such a silly rookie mistake to make. I think it's okay. I think that I can find some way to work around this. I'm really enjoying this process. This is really inspiring making these things. I'm coming up with so many different ideas. And I think I'm a little bit distracted because I've just got so many ideas for how I can reinterpret this and ways that I can take this in a more modern route, and like things that I would change and things I would keep the same, which is cool because that's exactly what this whole process was supposed to do, was inspire me and create a more, I guess, a deeper design process. I don't know, I'm a little bit distracted, which is a shame because I'm really enjoying this whole process and it's been a lot of fun to make these, and I am really looking forward to seeing how these look when they're on and feeling how they feel when they're on. I just have to finish them successfully first. Okay, it's fine. Let's do it. I personally do not care for using zip ties as boning, but I had quite a few left from my first attempt to do so. The longest standard zip ties I was able to source were 14.5 inches, and these bodies, like the last pair of stays I made with zip ties, required much longer boning, which meant I had to use monstrous 24-inch long, half-inch wide zip ties for the center front and center back portions. I trimmed all the boning to size one by one and slid the boning into the channels. Luckily, for me, there was already a bit of seam slippage due to the 1/8 inch seam, so I managed to shimmy into the boning channels through pre-existing entrances. I was really determined not to unpick any more binding than I absolutely had to, so boning became interesting in the channels that were a little further in from the small areas of seam slippage. Alas, these things can never just work out. Thus, we continue down the repeating zip tie hell loop. Totally could have done this pre-boning, but I stitched in the ditch along the side seam to keep the boning that ends at the side seam in place. I restitched the slipped seams and felled the rest of the leather over the edge. Having done this, I absolutely know why so many historical examples use leather as a binding now. It basically molded itself around the nooks and crannies of the edges so easily. I mean, my binding is far from ideal. I'd still flip under the raw edge of the leather on the wrong side in the future, but for what it was a good experience. I'd held off on binding the setter front because I didn't know if I would have enough leather, but I did. So I sewed more leather strips along center front and felled them in place. I sewed a line along the tops of the boning channels to keep the bones in place. These were always going to be tight lacing, and I didn't trust metal grommets to not rip out, so I happily hand sewed eyelets 3/4 inch apart down center front in a spiral lacing pattern, meaning the first and last eyelets on one side are 1/2 the usual distance apart, or 3/8 inch in my case, using silk buttonhole thread. I will absolutely be making a farthingale to go along with this, so I stitched 2 eyelets along the peaks of each of the skirts as well. The straps are laced to the front of the body, so each strap point and body peak got 1 eyelet. I am so glad I made these. Not only are they super cute as is, and totally valid in my modern wardrobe, but I am so inspired by the way they're made, the way they work, the way they feel. I have so many ideas for how to reinterpret them, and I know 100% it's much more nuanced than what I would have come up with had I just looked at a photo and started sketching. As I said a few moments ago, I'm going to make a quick farthingale for them next, but I hope you enjoyed watching this video because at least 2 more versions of these bodies are coming up. I mean, a lot of other stuff too, but so many ideas floating around my head for these. If you enjoyed this video, I always appreciate a thumbs up, and hit subscribe if you want to see a few other historical reinterpretations, followed by a couple more of these beauties. Bye!